Making a two-piece mold with 5140 platinum silicone. In this tutorial, we're going to show the process of making a two-piece mold or a two-sided mold with a resin backer. Now, this kind of mold, it's ideal to use a very firm silicone like the 5140, since we'll be casting flexible foam into this mold and it will need to withstand a decent amount of pressure. And also that very firm silicone also helps with alignment on a two-piece mold like this. Now, for this mold, we're going to be molding a pipe wrench, but it's important to remember that every three-dimensional object will present its own set of unique challenges. So let's take a look at this pipe wrench and figure out the best place to put our parting line. The parting line is where our mold will divide. So for this pipe wrench, this is overall pretty simple. We can actually follow the lines where the original wrench was cast, and this is typically what's referred to as a horizon line, the halfway point on a part. And we want to choose a simple place here that's easy to disguise later on. And a pipe wrench is nice because it's a mechanical part that originally came out of a mold, so if it has seam lines on it, it's obviously not the end of the world. But it's very important to make sure you study your original pattern and make sure you find an appropriate place to put that parting line. Now, the next thing we have to look for is problem areas from casting. Now we'll be pouring one of two materials into this mold, either a flexible casting rubber or an expanding foam. So we need to flip this up like it's going to be inside the mold and look for problem areas that will trap air during the casting process. So once we've identified those points, we're going to remember those later and come back to that once we've made our mold, because those are the areas where we're going to need to cut some special little channels or vents to allow the pressure to come out and the air bubbles to come out during the casting process. But again, more about that later. Now, once we've identified how we're going to part our mold, we're going to build our mold box. Now, this is a mold frame that we have that's just cut out of some pieces of plywood in these little L-shaped brackets. And these L shapes allowed you to construct a mold box of varying dimensions, from a square to a rectangle, and of course you can control the width and the length by how you expand that shape out. So this is a great general purpose mold box. It's easy to make out of plywood. And then you can use C-clamps to fix that in the right position for the mold. Now we're going to make one half of the mold first. And in order to define that first half of the mold, the first part that will be poured with silicone, we're going to make a bed of clay at the bottom of this mold box. Now, if you want to move fast, the best clay to use is water-based clay. Water-based clay is easy to smooth out with water, and it's inexpensive. So that's what we're going to be using here, but you can make a more precise bed of clay and a more precise dividing wall using oil-based clay like our Protolina modeling clay. So I'll put a link to that in the video description along with all the other materials we're using for this mold. But real important, if you are working really fast, a lot of our prop making customers that are on a tight time crunch will sometimes pour a clay bed using monster clay or the alien clay, or use a clay bed like this of a white modeling clay. Now, one of the reasons we're using a soft clay like this is it's very easy to get it to follow the parting line on the object. Now, this pipe wrench is unique in that it has a very straight parting line. Because this is a mechanical object, it has a very straight parting line, and that's very easy to achieve that straight line here. So what we're going to do is just get this as flat as we can get it, using a spatula or a trowel to smooth that out, and then I'm going to press that wrench down into that soft clay bed. And again, because I'm molding an object that does have an actual seam on it, I want my seam to be as close to that original seam as possible. But once I press that to the point that I like where it's at, I'm going to go back in and smooth out the clay and make sure I push it right up against the object, because obviously just pushing it down into the clay bed is not going to be as precise as getting that clay pushed right up to the edge. And what we're going for here is a right angle of that clay, that bed of clay, where it comes and meets the pattern. We want that to be as close to a right angle as possible, so we get a nice clean parting line there. And your parting line is as good as the work you put into it. I'm going to do a pretty fast one here, but you get the idea. The better you do on getting that clay bed made, and the flatter it is, the smoother it is, the better quality parting line you have later on. And of course, the less less flashing you have later. Now what I'm doing is cutting keys into that clay bed. I'm just using a simple loop tool. You could even use a wide paper clip, but the main thing here is I'm making a tongue and groove keyway that goes all the way around my pipe wrench. Now the reason I'm doing that kind of keyway and not just a bunch of just little indentation keys is that will actually act like a gasket. When I go to cast this wrench, when I close up that mold, since I'm going to be casting expanding foam, I want that finished rubber mold to lock together and function like a gasket around that part. And that, of course, will minimize leaks and casting material coming out of the mold. Now, in addition to that tongue and groove key that runs around the mold, I'm going to also take a little cylinder object. In this case, I used a battery that I lubed up with some Vaseline and just stuck that in to make some little peg-shaped keys around the perimeter of my object. And that just gives me additional alignment points. But it's important to remember that these two different type of keys serve slightly different function. Those little peg-shaped keys are great alignment points, but that tongue and groove keyway that goes all the way around the part, again, that helps the mold seal better and protects against leaks later on. Now, if you're using oil-based clay with this process, you could take literally days to do this and get this as perfect as possible. The downside to using water-based clay is you have to move fast because that water-based clay will start to dry out, and if you're working in a really dry climate, that's going to happen sooner rather than later. So remember, as soon as you start this clay wall, you need to be ready to make this mold because if this sits and dries out, it's going to be a big cracked mess later on. So important to remember that water-based clay dries out, and when you're using that for a parting line, you need to move quickly. So I made this parting line knowing that I was going to be pouring silicone over it within a few minutes. Now what I'm doing is cutting up some extra water-based clay and sculpting kind of a little funnel shape to put right down there at the bottom of the handle of the wrench. Now, because I'm mainly going to be casting expanding foam, it's not so much crucial that this is able to have foam poured into the mold as much as to have a place for the foam, the excess foam, to release out of the mold. Now, we'll also be pouring some casting rubber in this and maybe even some casting resin later on, but the main purpose of this mold will be for casting flexible foam. Now ready to apply our mold release. Now it's really important to use a mold release that does not contain silicone oil. So Zip 301 is such a release, but very important here because if you use a mold release that contains silicone oil, that can cause your silicone to actually bond to the pattern. And it's also really important that we make sure we apply that to our pattern, our wrench, and of course our clay wall and the mold box, because that pipe wrench being made of steel, that could attract the silicone and we could get a bond actually between our steel wrench and our silicone. And now ready to take our box dimensions and figure out how much silicone it's going to take to pour the first side of the mold. Now the formula for this is very simple: length times width times height. That's how you get your box dimensions for a mold like this. And once you've multiplied your length times width times height, that will give you a number in cubic inches. Now, once you have that new number, in this case, that's going to be 135 cubic inches. So we have a 1.5 inch deep mold box by 15 by 6, which gives us 135 cubic inches. So now we take that and divide that by the cubic inches per pound. So every silicone is going to be slightly different. This particular formula, we're going to be using the 5140 platinum silicone, and that is 24 cubic inches per pound. So now we take that 135 cubic inch total and divide that by 24, and that tells us exactly how many pounds of silicone that we need to pour that mold. Now remember, if you don't pour this as deep, that's going to take less silicone. So the main thing we want to make sure is that we have enough silicone to cover the part by about 1/2 inch. Now, this is also important about picking the silicone we're going to use for this mold. So going back to the Shore A scale, remember the Shore A scale spans the very soft, like human skin, down at the around the 10 range, up to very firm, like a 90, like a roller skate wheel. And it's important to be familiar with this scale because different objects are going to require different silicones or different soft materials to make those molds. So something with a lot of deep undercuts might require a really soft silicone, whereas something like a mechanical part like this might require something firmer. So here we're going to use the 5140, which is a 40 on the Shore A scale. And again, the reason for that, this is a more angular part, but more importantly, this is a part that's going to be a two-piece mold, and we're going to be pouring in flexible foam that's going to be expanding under pressure. So we want a fairly firm silicone for that so the mold doesn't distort when it's clamped together. So now that we know what silicone we're using, let's go over the properties. This is, of course, 5140 platinum silicone. This is a 1-to-1 mix ratio. This is a fairly firm 40 Shore A silicone. Again, we need that firm 40A so that when we clamp these two halves together under pressure, we don't wind up with distortions at our seam, because a really soft silicone, we could actually have the seam buckle a little bit if we clamp it too tight. And this is actually a relatively low viscosity silicone. This is a 6800 centipoise and fairly fast setting. We have a 30-minute working time and about a 4-hour demold at room temperature. Now here we're going to measure out our silicone. Now this is actually a different batch of silicone, so if any of you, the more astute viewers, will notice that I'm not mixing up a full 5 pounds here. But this is a very simple silicone to mix and use. But also important to remember, because this is a colorless translucent silicone, those of you that are concerned about mixing, if you're new to using a silicone like this, sometimes it helps to throw a little bit of silicone pigment into that just so you can see when everything is thoroughly mixed. Now, another thing I'm not going to be showing here is I did subject this to a vacuum. We put this in a vacuum pot and pulled all the air bubbles out, which is a very fast process. But again, that's where that 30-minute working time really comes in handy. We have more than enough time to get everything thoroughly mixed and vacuum degassed and then poured over our pattern. And a quick word about thorough mixing. Thorough is the key here. You don't want to think in terms of how long you're mixing. You want to think about how thoroughly you're mixing and how accurately you're mixing. Because you could spend all day mixing, but if your stir stick never touches the sides or the bottom of the bucket, you are not mixing accurately and properly. So make sure you're turning that bucket and scraping the sides and the bottom of the bucket several times so all of those components are properly incorporated in the mixture. Now, an interesting thing that I noticed with this particular pour, I pulled a vacuum on this, but I pulled this bucket of silicone out of the vacuum chamber almost as soon as it collapsed. And it was kind of strange. It had a lot of bubbles in it, and I was surprised that it had as many bubbles as it did, given that I just pulled a vacuum. But the funny thing is, those all still went away. So I'm not a scientist, so I can't explain that. But it is interesting that if you pull it out a little too early out of the vacuum chamber, those bubbles are more evident, but they still do disappear. So interesting phenomenon, and again, the more science-minded people I'm sure can step in and explain that anomaly to me. Now, this is after the pour has sat a little bit, and you see that indeed all of those bubbles are gone. And what I'm doing here is just going in with a stir stick and just breaking up any of the bubbles rising up. And now we're going to let the silicone cure for about 4 hours at room temperature. And now that it's set up, we're ready to cut some keys into the back side of the silicone. Now, this will all make sense later on, but the idea here is by cutting these little triangle-shaped keys in the top of the silicone, that's going to help the resin line back up later on. Now, it would be real simple to make a mold like this and just use a couple of pieces of scrap plywood cut down to fit this, but by cutting some keyways into that silicone and pouring some resin, what we can do is we wind up with a resin backing for this mold that fits it perfectly. And having those little keyways cut into the back of the silicone help us know which side is which when later on we're cutting these at slightly different on each side of the mold. So the resin backing will know exactly which side fits which. And again, that'll make more sense later on. But by doing this, by cutting this out, cutting these little keyways in here and then pouring resin on the back side of the silicone mold, we have a nice tidy kind of mold sandwich later on. Now what I'm going to do before I pour my resin is I'm going to release that mold box with some Pardal high temp wax. Now the high temp wax is better when you're dealing with a resin that exotherms like the TC800 that we'll be using here. What we're going to do is mainly use that to keep the resin from sticking to that mold box, because resin will want to stick to plywood. So it's real important to make sure you get that paste wax applied all over the inside of that mold box and also down into those keyways. And once that's applied, you want to allow that to dry. And then we're ready to pour our TC800. And another one of the reasons that I like this method is it's inevitable if you do any of this work for any length of time, you're going to have resin sitting around, partial kits of resin sitting around your shop. And this is a great use for that extra resin. So what I'll do is figure out roughly how much resin it's going to take using that same volume formula, figure out about how many cubic inches of backer I need on this. And I'll mix up some resin and pour that over the back side of the mold. And again, that just gives me a nice custom backing for that mold that I can then later just strap that whole assembly together, and it makes for a nice tidy mold box. Now, a quick word about TC800 casting resin. This is just kind of a basic casting resin formula, but it's also a really hard casting resin formula, so we don't have to worry about this warping when it's all strapped together. But TC800 has about a 2 to 2.5 minute working time at room temperature and about a 15 to 20 minute demold depending on the cross section. So as soon as that catalyzes, when this cures, it changes color. This will cure bright white. So once that cures completely, we're ready to pull off our mold box, flip the whole thing over, and start on the other side of the mold. Now, most all of the work on a mold like this is going to be on that parting line and that clay on the first half of the mold. Once that's done, it's really downhill from there, because once you've defined that parting line with your clay, the rest of this is pretty straightforward and pretty simple. But one of the other nice reasons for using the water-based clay over oil-based clay is cleanup is very easy on this, because once we peel off that water-based clay, we're ready to just use a damp cloth or damp paper towel to wipe away any of that clay residue that might be on the other side of our model. So very easy cleanup. Again, though, you want to do this pretty quick and get all this turned around so you can immediately pour the second half of your mold. So a mold like this, because it does have a fairly quick set time on that 5140, it is possible to pour a mold like this in a single day. Now, if you're working in a warm shop in the summer here in Texas, you could probably do it even faster than that. But because of that 4-hour set time, it was easy for us to make the first half of this mold and have it set up by after lunchtime. And I was able to open everything up and pour the second half of the mold, and then I let the second half set overnight. Now here I'm using some of the scrap water-based clay to go in and seal up the mold box, because again, if we don't seal those edges, that silicone will leak out those corners. So make sure you seal up all of those edges around where the silicone meets back up with the box, because once you break that seal in the first half and reassemble the mold together, it will want to leak out those areas. So make sure you seal everything up, and when in doubt, you can always come around the outside of the mold box with a hot glue gun and seal everything up there for extra protection. Now ready to apply more of our Zip 301 mold release. Now we want to spray that thoroughly all over that exposed silicone mold and all over our pipe wrench and the mold box, but also really important to take a disposable brush and brush that into all of the details there, because that very fresh silicone that we use for the first side of the mold, if we're not careful, this is where we could have bonding occur between this new silicone that we're about to pour and that first half of the mold. So make sure you get everything released properly and give it adequate time to dry. I usually let this sit for about 20 minutes before I pour the second half of the mold. And now this is more 5140 that we've mixed up and vacuum degassed and ready to pour that over our pattern. And as a rule, I like my tolerances to be about a ½ inch over the highest point of the pattern. You may not have to go as thick on some patterns, but to make a nice thick mold that holds up well in production, those are kind of the tolerances I go for. It's about a ½ inch of clearance over my part. And again, remember that we have a 30-minute working time and about a 3 to 4 hour demold at room temperature. If you're working in a warmer environment, if it's 85 to 90 degrees, that's going to go a lot faster, so be aware of that. And anytime you're working with new formulas like this, it's always a good idea to keep a timer handy to keep track of your working time, because it's easy for that time to get away from you if you're not careful. Now this is about 4 hours later, and we're ready to do the same business on this side of the mold. Go in with a scalpel and cut out more keyways for that second half, and you'll notice I'm cutting these in different places than the previous side, and that is of course by design, because I want it to be very clear which half of the mold goes with which half of the mold of the resin backing. And of course, once I'm done cutting out those keyways, I'm going to release that with more of that Pardal high temp paste wax. And again, the reason for that Pardal high temp wax is TC800 does exotherm fairly hot when it goes off. So paste wax is okay, but that high temp paste wax is even better, and that just protects the wood against that resin trying to bond to the wood. And sometimes with some paste waxes, you could have that resin exotherm and actually melt through the wax. So the Pardal high temp wax is extra protection against that. And now ready to pour the second half of our resin backing for our mold. And again, this is more of the TC800 casting resin. And again, TC800 has about a 2.5 minute working time and about a 15 to 20 minute demold at room temperature. And it's mixed 1-to-1 by volume. So very simple resin. But again, one of the reasons I like this approach for making two-piece molds is this is a great way to use up extra resin sitting around in partial kits, making these backings for these molds like this. Now, one last little step I like to do, I didn't show this with the first half, but just giving a quick blast of that E236 mold release to break the surface tension, and that gets us a nice clean surface on our mold. And we're ready to let our resin set up. And now we have our finished mold ready to disassemble. Now, I let this set up overnight because I poured it at the end of a work day, but real important to remember that we could easily demold that in about 3 to 4 hours, especially if we're in a warm workshop. So again, that 4-hour demold time, you can always speed that up with heat. But as it is, that 30-minute working time and 4-hour demold, that is plenty fast for most projects. And again, the nice thing about this is we wind up with that nice, really firm silicone that's excellent for casting foam like this. Now I'm just going to go in with a scalpel and clean up any little bits of silicone that, because again, this is a pipe wrench and some of that silicone seeped down into the mechanical part of that wrench. I'm just cutting that extra silicone away. And again, remember those vents that I mentioned earlier. So we have our pipe wrench, and again, you want to think of it upside down when we're pouring in. We want to think about those points where it dead ends, those high points like that will trap air bubbles. So we want to be mindful of those, and those are the areas where we're going to cut our vents. So we're going to take a scalpel and cut some little V-shaped trenches in one side of the mold. And remember, these don't need to be huge. We just need some thin little trenches or a thin little pathways for that air to vent out. And what that does is allows those air bubbles to escape when they're compressed into those high points of the mold. So as our foam is expanding, that allows the air to get pushed out of the way. So again, we don't need a whole lot of space there, but as you can see, I'm just cutting a little V-shaped trench in that mold and connecting those parts of the opening of the pipe wrench. And then I'm going to do the same thing back here and connect that part right back to the handle of the wrench at a diagonal there. So again, just going from the high point there across and just creating a little V-shaped trench, and just enough so that that air, as that air gets compressed into that section, the foam can actually fill up that whole area and push that excess air out into the handle and of course out the top of the mold. So very simple way to create vents, and the main reason I'm doing it like this after I made the mold rather than building those into the mold is sometimes you need to make a cast before you know exactly where those spots are. So just remember, you can always add vents to a mold, you can't take them back out. Now I'm using a wood rasp to clean up the edges of that resin backer, and our mold is ready to use. But you see how we have that nice tidy little mold sandwich, and here I brushed in some metal pigment powder into our wrench mold that will then transfer to the part. And what I'm pouring up here is some of the TC284 flexible foam. Now TC284 is a variable density flexible foam, and it goes fast, so you'll see I'm having to move like a crack-addled spider monkey here. But the 284 can either be mixed up to an 8-pound density, which is what we're using here, or a really dense 13-pound density. So a lot of possibilities with that. But this particular foam, again, it goes off pretty quick, so you want to make sure you get that into the mold fast and get that mold secured. And then our demold time on this, I usually like to let it sit for about 30 to 45 minutes before I demold. And stay tuned for a more thorough casting video featuring the TC284 flexible foam, but that'll give you a basic idea of how this mold works. But you see the whole idea there of brushing that pigment powder into the mold is that uses the adhesive potential of that 284 to bond and pull those metal powders out of the mold and give us a part that takes very little finishing work to get a nice realistic foam prop wrench. And here I'm just dry brushing some of the Sculpt Nouveau Silver B metal coating over the top of that. And now we have a fight scene prop that's ready to bonk some zombies on the head. So there you have the process of making a 2-piece mold for a prop pipe wrench using the 5140 firm silicone rubber. And of course, all of the materials used in this tutorial will be linked in the video description, the 5140 as well as, of course, the TC284 flexible foam. All of the mold releases and accessories and whatnot will all be linked in the video description, as well as a link to our video library, so be sure to check that out. But all of the materials we use in our tutorials are available in our web store at brickintheyard.com. So thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe and click the little bell icon so you get notified when we post new content. And thanks again for watching and tolerating all of our foolishness for almost 20 years now.